We're about to begin our first session of the day here in the main garden, and the session is titled Home Fire, and Rosinka Chaudhary will be the moderator, and she'll be in conversation with Kamila Shamsi. Can I request Rosinka Chaudhary to come on stage and invite Kamila Shamsi to join her. Rosinka.
Right. Sorry, so that's typical of me in that I brought everything. I brought the book, I brought my laptop, arrived here on time and realized that I'd left the 2 introductory sheets, which I actually printed out all the way back in Calcutta behind in the room. Although, of course, I could have started very easily by simply saying to an audience in her hometown that Kamila needs no introduction. She really doesn't. But I find that to be a bit of a cop-out because it helps sometimes to be reminded of what somebody in your city has achieved over the years. So I will sort of firstly give you what the organizers gave me and then a little bit more that I found on Wikipedia. So, Kamila Shamsi is regarded as among the most accomplished of Pakistani novelists writing in English. Hailing from Karachi, she is the author of 7 novels, including her latest, Home Fire, which was longlisted for the Booker Prize and shortlisted for the Costa Prize. Her novels have been translated into more than 20 languages. 3 of her novels have won awards from the Pakistani Academy of Letters. In 2013, she was named among Granta magazine's Best of Young British Novelists. That was all I was supposed to have said, but Wikipedia threw up some interesting facts that I'll just, share with you. You already know, of course, I would assume that she's the daughter of journalist and editor Muniza Shamsi. And it says granddaughter of Begum Jahanara Habibullah. She was brought up in Karachi. She went to school here. She then took a BA in creative writing from Hamilton College and an MFA from the MFA program for poets and writers at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, where she was influenced, it says, by the Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali. In 2007, she moved to London, and she's now a dual national of the UK and Pakistan. There are a whole host of prizes, short listing for prizes that are easily available on the page. Since we're already late, I will stop the introduction there and begin the conversation. Kamila, for those of the people here in the audience today who don't know this, this book, Home Fire, is an adaptation of Sophocles' Antigone. Why Antigone, and why in this genre?
First of all, thank you, Rosinka, for the introduction. Thank you to all of you for turning up. I know 11 a.m. on Saturday in Karachi is like 8 a.m. for many people, so thank you for being here. There are some writers who have the next 5 or 7 or 10 novels they want to write already mapped out in their mind. Not many, but occasionally you run across one of them. I used to be someone who would finish one and immediately know what the next was, but I've stopped being that person, so I have to search much harder. And when I finished my last novel, A God in Every Stone, I had no idea what I wanted to write next or when or where it would be set. And in this time of really not knowing what I was doing, I got an email from a man who runs a theatre in South London. His name was Jitendra Verma. It's a place called Tara Arts, and they've been around for a long time and do fantastic work around South Asian, British South Asian drama. And he called me in and he said, I really like the way you do dialogue. I'd like you to adapt a play for me. One of the Greek tragedies, for instance. How about Antigone? So really it was his idea. I had read Antigone at university. I didn't remember it at all. I mean, I sat there nodding because you don't want to say I don't remember Antigone, but I really didn't remember Antigone. But I said, well, that's interesting. Maybe I'll think about it. And then I went away, and for those of you who don't know Antigone, it's not necessary to go out and find out what the play is about. I'd say, in fact, if you haven't, don't. But just to give you sort of the central idea, the play starts with two sisters. And their two brothers have just been killed in a war on opposite sides. And one of the brothers is being given a full state funeral as a hero. The other brother is a traitor to the city. And the king has decreed that his body will be left on the ground to rot. He won't be buried, as a punishment to him and as an example to other would-be traitors. So we have these two sisters. They've just lost both their brothers. They are the children of Oedipus, so they've grown up under Oedipus and Jocasta, so they've grown up under shame because they're the children of incest. And one of the sisters, Ismene, says, well, this is terrible, but what can we do? We're just women, we have to obey what the king says. And the other sister, Antigone, says, no, I will bury my brother. And that really is the heart of it, is how these two sisters respond. You can either say to grief or to an unjust law. And actually it's both, how they're responding to both and how they're responding to each other. And when I sort of looked up the play, really I did what you did with me. I went on Wikipedia and just to remind myself, looked at plot outline. And I didn't seriously think I was going to do it, partly because I don't know how to write a play, to answer your question about genre. But it was an idea, it was something to think about. And almost immediately I knew the story I wanted to overlay on it. And we don't want to give too many spoilers for people who haven't read the book, but this was a moment in Britain where, and it has been for a while, where there's a lot in the press about British Muslims who are enemies of the state. And the question of what the state does with them. But I was also interested in what then happens to the families when these young men and very occasionally women are treated as enemies of the state. How does the family respond within Britain? And I just saw how that story could be overlaid onto Antigone. And I found that I was thinking about it more and more. And I also found that I'm a novelist, not a playwright. So even though I'd been asked to do it as a play, my brain didn't seem to know how to. I kept thinking in terms of scenes in a novel. And at some point I realized that I was thinking of a novel and I'd have to write it as a novel, and I'd have to apologize and thank Jatinder for my failure to do what he asked. But really it was that combination that it has within it both, and the Greeks often do this, it has a very intimate family story. It is about siblings, and it's also because it's Greek tragedy, one of the sisters, Antigone, the one who says, I will bury my brother, is also engaged to the king's son, who is also her cousin. So it's these two interlinked families, but it's also about a much larger sort of political kind of framework, and the ideas of law and justice. And what do you do when the law is not just? And all those things together I thought were very fertile.
So I was wondering how much of the plot you wanted to discuss. We don't want to give too much away, but on the other hand, for instance, you've kept some syllabic connection. For instance, the character of Antigone over here is Anika, Ismene is Isma.
Haemon is Aemon.
Yes, exactly. So there is a correspondence, but we won't discuss the story. What we'll discuss a little bit is, I'll ask you a question about structure, and then I want to read just certain dialogues, certain lines from sections of the book to you, and ask you questions based on that. Regarding the structure, the book is divided into sections where each character or each character's voice speaks to you. So we begin with Isma. So there is a section titled Isma, and in that section it is Isma's a character who is actually speaking to the reader, followed by Aemon, and it ends with Karamat Lone, which is the figure of Creon. So Creon, Karamat. The first time that I've come across a novel from the subcontinent structured in this way is actually Rabindranath Tagore's Ghore Baire, which is translated as Home in the World,
Right.
which was written in 1905, actually, where he has the story told by the landlord character, Nikhilesh, his wife, Bimola, and the revolutionary stroke terrorist, actually, interestingly, Shondeep. The voices are the ones who give us the story. Why did you, or what made you decide to use this particular structure? Did you have any antecedents in mind, or was it just that was the way you wanted to do it?
I don't think I thought of particular antecedents, but there's a line by John Berger, which I think has probably been more influential among a certain group of novelists than any other, which was Berger saying, "Never again will a single story be told as though it were the only one." And you see this line coming up again and again, whether it's Nadeem Aslam, whether it's Teju Cole, whether it's Ali Smith. I mean, writers from all over the place will be invoking this line. And I was certainly thinking of it when I wanted to give these different points of view. But partly also, I wanted it to be a book about the things we don't see, and how certain we are of our own realities. And then you look at the person next to you, and even if they're your brother or sister, their reality may be different. And so partly this was a book about how you can have three siblings, grow up in the same house, are very close, and yet the way they think of their own lives and each other
And respond.
are so very different, and they're always missing each other. And I was interested also to, you'd often hear or read newspaper reports of someone whose family member has gone bad in some way. And the members in the family, sometimes they would say, "Oh yes, we haven't spoken to him in years, we want nothing to do." And other times, the family members would say, "We're horrified, we had no idea." Now, some people might think, "Oh, they're lying to absolve themselves of guilt," and maybe in some cases they are, but I think it's actually very possible to not know what happens to someone who you're very close to. And I think in some way, if you're really close to a person, it's easy to assume, I know this person, I know what they're capable of, and you might be quite blind to seeing them change. And that was one of the things I wanted to explore in here, is that lack of seeing. But the other thing was also that, so we have these three siblings who grew up in one part of London, and we're not going to give too much away on plot, but one of the things that you find out relatively early on is that the father who abandoned them, who they never knew, in the 90s, he basically abandoned his family to go and fight jihad in Bosnia, and sort of disappeared. So they're the children of that kind of British Muslim, I suppose. And on the other side, you have Karamat Lone, who's the first British Muslim Home Secretary. And his reality and their reality are so different.
Completely different.
And part of what happens in the novel is the inability to see or want to see the complete story of anyone else's life.
Sure. So, on page 21, I'm going to read you a couple of lines.
Yeah.
I won't explain context, and I won't waste time I'll just read some lines of dialogue. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "The turban, is that a style thing or a Muslim thing? You know, the only two people in Massachusetts who have ever asked me about it both wanted to know if it's a style thing or a chemo thing. Laughing, he said, cancer or Islam, which is the greater affliction? There were still moments when a statement like that could catch a person off guard. He held his hands up quickly in apology. Jesus, sorry, that came out really badly. It must be difficult to be Muslim in the world these days. I'd find it more difficult to not be Muslim, she said." From that passage, what I wanted to ask you was, did you feel it incumbent upon you in some way to address this, what you call being a Muslim in the world these days? Did you feel it incumbent upon you to address that in some way?
No, I don't think a novel comes out of feeling it incumbent upon you to address something. A piece of journalism might, a comment piece might come out of that, or an essay might. A novel works in much more mysterious and intimate ways. And the way the novel works is someone says Antigone, and you think, oh, here's this story that's interesting to me, that's in the newspapers, and you're really writing it because, I write because I'm interested in something and want to know more about it, rather than I feel I need to address something.
Sure.
But of course, one of the things that happens is that while you're following your interest, the story around it expands, and you discover the mini stories in there that you're interested. But it's never a thing of what I must address with a novel. It's more a question of the novel. Writing the novel helps you work out the things that have been working away at the back of your brain that you've been thinking about,
Sure.
And are now making their way.
Sure. I didn't really mean that question so much as a programmatic sort of, a sort of decision that I must address this question like a politician. No, I meant it more in the sense of being in the world. Because, as you said a little while ago, because we travel, because we stay in between places, so much of what has been happening in the world, so much of media space, whether it's on the television screens or in newspapers, is dominated by this sort of news, that it makes you feel uncomfortable, even as a person from the subcontinent.
Sure.
I mean, even for those of us from India, we wonder when we are passing through security checks, or we wonder, well, how we have a name Chowdhury, which is a Muslim name as well. Before they actually see your passport, they may, people may think I'm carrying a backpack, I look subcontinental, I hope this is not suspicious.
Sure.
That sort of, it's sort of being in the world, which is
I think
more of what I meant.
Yes, I understand that now. I think it's a complex question to answer,
sure.
because I think part of what happens, as part of this being in the world, part of being Pakistani but living in London, traveling around, and of course being aware of what gets said, and that, of course, that moment of your passport.
Yes.
And also seeing how dramatically your travel experience shifts the moment you get a British passport and you're not traveling as a Pakistani. It's like a different world that you're in.
Yes.
In a way that is actually feels really uncomfortable the first few. It feels really nice, and then you feel very uncomfortable in how easy it all is. And I think what's happened as a result is that those things have all become things that internally I'm very aware of and interested in.
Yes.
And so that I suppose it was inevitable in some way that at some point it would come out in a novel.
What I thought. Yeah. Okay. Second, a few lines. I don't mind. Do you know any Urdu? He shook his head, a response his singing had anticipated, and she said, so you don't understand Betakallufi. Forgive my pronunciation.
No, it's perfect.
He sat up straight and raised his hand like a schoolboy. I do know that one. It's informality as an expression of intimacy. She experienced a brief moment of wonder that a father who hadn't taught his son basic Urdu had still thought to teach him this word, etc. But in the question I ask follows from a line in the following page, actually, after another page, regarding the two of them. Just one line here, suddenly in the middle of the page, says, it was 9 days since he decided they should be informal in intimacy together. So the question, as you can anticipate, is about language. And the manner, so this is not the tired old question about why you don't write in Urdu, whether Urdu, not any of that, but more to ask how the Urdu language impinges on your writing in English. Because there you actually explained a phrase to us, the meaning of a phrase to us, and then without any self-consciousness or putting it within quotes, or you use the explanation you'd given for that phrase to describe the sort of intimacy that was developing between these two characters. So how would you sort of describe that process with language?
So just to give some context, within that it's these two British characters meeting in America, but one, has been raised by a father in a way that's, his mother's American, he's been raised to have very little ties to his Pakistani heritage, and the other one speaks Urdu and has grown up with a much stronger sense of that tie. I think probably one of the things that happens when you leave Pakistan for the first time and go somewhere else, in my case it was America, is you really become aware of how language is a carrier of culture. You'll notice certain things, so that even those of us who grew up with English as a first language, when we got to America and were appalled by the dining hall food, realized that we knew the names of all the masalas only in Urdu. What is ilaichi, what is garam masala, what is haldi, and that it was sort of an interesting moment to realize those bits of your life, even though you think my language is English, but that there's certain things, and then you realize that there's certain concepts, such as betakallufi, which, because Urdu has that word, people are betakalluf with each other in a way, whereas you can be friends with someone in America or Britain and it can be a very close and meaningful friendship, and they will do all kinds of things for you, but there'll always be a certain sort of formality and reserve. I mean, I can walk into the home of many of my Pakistani friends and saying, I'm starving, what's there to eat? But with my Angrez friends, I feel that's slightly cheeky, that you'd have to sit there and then wait to be offered something, and you can't just demand. And if they do offer you something, you certainly can't say, is that all there is? Sure. And so I think it was really an awareness that you think the word is missing in this world, and with that word come a whole host of behaviors.
Exactly. Associations.
And associations. And that it's, there's some things that aren't really directly translatable. And it does make you interested in, what are the concepts that, or phrases that exist in one language, and what does it mean? I mean, one of my earlier books, in Burnt Shadows, there's a point where a young man from Delhi is talking about the English language, and there's someone he knows is mourning. And he says in English, there's the expression, leave someone alone with their grief. Urdu doesn't have a phrase like that, And it is, I mean, one of the very odd things about being in Britain is around things like mourning, where you do leave mourners alone, which is so antithetical to the way we think you should behave. And so things like that all, it comes down to the language
all the time.
And what's in the language.
Yes.
Yeah.
It reminds me of a scene in a Hollywood sort of film with Adam Sandler. I can't remember the name of it, but the character that he sort of falls in love with, the housekeeper to his house actually, is Mexican, and she has a daughter. And when when she realizes that this man who she works for and has a happy family man is falling in love with her, she actually withdraws and leaves the employer and takes her teenage daughter and leaves. And they're standing at a bus stop. And the teenage daughter is really upset because there's a lovely beach house, those children are her friends, and so she's sulking, and when the mother tries to approach her, she says, give me some space, because she's really upset. She says, just don't, give me some space. So the mother is stunned for a minute, and she speaks in a Mexican accent. She's like, suddenly she says, listen, we're Mexican. You're my daughter. There's no space. No space. So, something like that, right? Yeah. So, would you like to read a little bit from the novel?
Sure. I'll read, well, I suppose I'll read the beginning because then I don't have to explain anything, right? Isma was going to miss her flight. The ticket wouldn't be refunded because the airline took no responsibility for passengers who arrived at the airport 3 hours ahead of the departure time and were escorted to an interrogation room. She had expected the interrogation, but not the hours of waiting that would precede it, nor that it would feel so humiliating to have the contents of her suitcase inspected. She'd made sure not to pack anything that would invite comments or questions. No Quran, no family pictures, no books on her area of academic interest. But even so, the officer took hold of every item of Isma's clothing and ran it between her thumb and fingers, not so much searching for hidden pockets as judging the quality of the material. Finally, she reached for the designer-labeled down jacket that Isma had folded over a chair back when she entered, and held it up, one hand pinching each shoulder. "This isn't yours," she said. And Isma was sure she didn't mean because it's at least a size too large for you, but rather, it's too nice for someone like you. I used to work in a dry cleaning shop. The woman who brought it in said she didn't want it when we couldn't get rid of the stain. She pointed to the grease mark on the pocket. Does the manager know you took it? I was the manager. You were the manager of a dry cleaning shop, and now you're on your way to a PhD program in sociology in Amherst, Massachusetts. Yes. And how did that happen? My siblings and I were orphaned just after I finished uni. They were 12 years old, twins. I took the first job I could find. Now they're grown up, I can go back to my life. You're going back to your life in Amherst, Massachusetts. I meant the academic life. The woman dropped the jacket into a jumble of clothes and shoes and told Isma to wait. That had been a while ago. The plane would be boarding now. Isma looked over at the suitcase. She'd repacked when the woman left the room and spent the time since worrying if doing that without permission constituted an offense. Should she empty the clothes out into a haphazard pile, or would that make things even worse? She stood up, unzipped the suitcase and flipped it open so its contents were visible. A man entered the office carrying Isma's passport, laptop and phone. She allowed herself to hope, but he sat down, gestured for her to do the same, and placed a voice recorder between them. Do you consider yourself British? The man said. I am British. But do you consider yourself British? I've lived here all my life. She meant there was no other country of which she could feel herself a part, but the words came out sounding evasive. The interrogation continued for nearly 2 hours. He wanted to know her thoughts on Shias, homosexuals, the Queen, democracy, the Great British Bake Off, the invasion of Iraq, Israel, suicide bombers, dating websites. After that early slip regarding her Britishness, she settled into the manner that she'd practiced, with Anika playing the role of the interrogating officer and Isma responding to her sister as though she was a customer of dubious political opinions whose business she didn't want to lose by voicing strenuously opposing views, but to whom she didn't see the need to lie either. So, for instance, when people talk about the enmity between Shias and Sunni, it usually centers around some political imbalance of power, such as in Iraq or in Syria. As a Brit, I don't distinguish between one Muslim and another. Or, occupying other people's territory generally causes more problems than it solves. This served for both Iraq and Israel. Killing civilians is sinful. That's equally true if the manner of killing is a suicide bombing or aerial bombardments or drone strikes. There were long intervals of silence between each answer and the next question as a man clicked keys on her laptop, examining her browser history. He knew that she was interested in the marital status of an actor from a popular TV series, knew that wearing a hijab didn't stop her from buying expensive products to tame her frizzy hair, knew that she had searched for how to make small talk with Americans. You know, you don't have to be so compliant about everything, Anika had said during the role-playing. Her sister, not quite 19, with her law student brain, who knew everything about her rights and nothing about the fragility of her place in the world. For instance, if they ask you about the Queen, just say, as an Asian, I have to admire her color palette. Instead, Isma had responded, I greatly admire Her Majesty's commitment to her role. But there had been a comfort in hearing her sister's alternative answers in her head, her ha of triumph, when the official asked a question she'd anticipated and that Isma had dismissed, such as the Great British Bake Off one. Well, if they didn't let her board this plane, or anyone after this, she would go home to Anika, which is what half Isma's heart knew it should do in any case. How much of Anika's heart wanted that was a hard question to answer. She'd been so adamant that Isma not change her plans for America, and whether this was selflessness or a wish to be left alone was something even Anika herself didn't seem to know. A tiny flicker in Isma's brain signaled a thought about her brother, Pervez, that was trying to surface before it was submerged by the strength of her refusal to ever think about him again.
Thank you. So that question that the interrogation officer asks Isma, and you can think of me here as the interrogation officer, is a question I wanted to ask you.
Okay.
How British do you consider yourself?
You know, it's interesting, the first time I used the pronoun we to refer to the British was the morning after the Brexit vote, when it became obvious what a disaster Britain had voted for, and I said, what have we done? And then I thought, this is a signal of how Pakistani I am, that it takes the nation to do something really disastrous for me to feel a part of it. I don't know, it's an odd question. I mean, you know, I'm a dual national, but I've been Pakistani all my life. I've never had to think about it. It's just there. And the question is, what does it mean to feel British? I mean, I never have to ask, what does it mean to feel Pakistani? Because it's not. What does it mean to feel British? I'm not sure I know the answer to that. But part of it, I think, is, and that's what really the Brexit moment was about, is you feel implicated in your country's disasters. You know,
sure.
I think that's part of it. So that part of it is there. I certainly think of myself as a Londoner, it's different to the way I think of myself as a Karachiwala, but I think it's possible, it's much easier to know what it means to be part of a city, of a big city, a big cosmopolitan city. You're aware, I'm aware if I look at British history, that it's very entwined with the subcontinent, but that the angle at which I'm looking at it from is and always will be of the subcontinent side of it. And yet that is now my home. And, you know, I feel caught up with it. On a day-to-day basis, I now know more about the politics of Britain and the politicians of Britain than I do of Pakistan. But the interesting thing for me, actually, was that it wasn't that becoming a citizen, swearing an oath of allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen and her successors, which I really had to do, or getting the passport was what made anything emotional shift. It was writing this book, because it's the first book I've written that is set in contemporary Britain. It's about characters who are British, and it required me to imaginatively enter those lives and feel, you know, you feel very intimate with your characters and their world. So in some weird way, this fictional world made me feel much more caught up with and invested in contemporary Britain than the actual process of living there. But the other thing also is, I think we have to recognize that citizenship is also a legal state. You know, a legal status. And so the question that someone said to me, oh, it's a good question he asks, a journalist, you know, how British are you really? And I said, it's a terrible question. Because you need to accept, if someone has that passport, then legally they are entirely as British as anyone born there, and no official has a right to ask them that question, but how British are you really? You know, you have to also, so I think as migrants, second generation migrants, third generation migrants, there's another point, which is that you assert, I am this as much as anyone else. You don't question it. You don't get to say, I don't really belong, or that I have fewer rights here than anyone born in here. And that's something that writing the book certainly brought up.
Sure.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that infamous moment in British politics that I'm sure you remember, Norman Tebbit, and the whole issue of why Pakistani immigrants' children should be cheering for the Pakistani team at the Oval or Lords. And he had, of course, sort of suggested that that should be a question to be asked to immigrants, which cricket team do you cheer for when Pakistan plays England? And there had been a robust defense at that time to allow in multicultural Britons citizens of the country of whichever origin to cheer for whichever team they felt like, that shouldn't be made a test of their sort of quote-unquote loyalty to the country. Do you think things have changed a little politically since then? Well,
I mean, you know, things have to always come back to cricket. I should say that a couple of years ago I was interviewing Peter Oborne, who of course has written a lot about Pakistan cricket. And I said, when England is playing Pakistan, who do you support? And he said, Pakistan. And I said, you failed the Tebbit test. And he laughed and he said, that's right, I do. And I know several English people who do fail the Tebbit test. The interesting thing is, I think today you will find more British Pakistanis cheering for the English team than previously. And there's a very good reason for it. It has several names. One of those names is Moeen Ali. One of those names is Nasir Hussain. What happened, what Tebbit didn't count on, was that the English team would change. The English team would start to have superstars with name like Moeen Ali.
Yes.
And he thought that it was up to the migrants to change their culture, when actually it was up to the England Cricket Board to change its culture. And you know, I think it's one of the interesting moments, and one of the things I was interested in with this book is it's true that you have now tremendous Islamophobia in Britain, you know, and you can say that yes, gains have been made in terms of the horrendous racism of the 60s, and there's still a lot of racism, and Brexit has brought it up, but it's not at the same level as the 70s, and yet the specific Islamophobia has risen a great deal, and yet on the other side of things, there's a Moeen Ali. Britain has London has a mayor called Sadiq Khan. Within the Tory cabinet, you have a Sajid Javed. You had, until she resigned over Gaza, you had a Saida Versi. Now, 30 or 40 years ago, you wouldn't see those kind of names at the forefront of British politics. And I don't want to overstate it, but it's now this sort of back and forth. And that because you have the children of migrants making a greater name, there's also a greater backlash against that. So it's a push and pull, but it's certainly not the same as it was a generation or two ago. It's not even the same as it was 15 years ago, I don't think.
Sure.
Yeah.
The other question I sort of wanted to ask you was a rather obvious one, perhaps, but worth asking in some senses, although we've more or less covered some of the ground that such a question sort of might entail, which was the question of self-division. You just said, from the portion you just read, in fact, I had highlighted that particular bit where, you know, she's asked, is she, you know, does she think of herself as British? These are characters who are both Muslim and British. They speak in Urdu and English. They live in Karachi and London. These are things you've been talking about. What it reminded me of, this condition that actually in some senses we all inhabit, whether we are British citizens or Indian or Pakistani citizens. I think we all inhabit it from the moment of modernity, I would say even from a century ago. Since colonization, that is something that and in fact, sorry, to correct myself, I would not even say since colonization, because you think of that as British colonization. In the subcontinent, certainly, things have always been very hybrid. There was a Hindu culture, there was a Muslim culture, there was a, you know, the culture that grew out of, and there were Christians, there was a Buddhist, the Sikh minority, what grew in modernity was inevitably a hybrid culture. And that predates British colonialism.
Sure.
If you look at the sort of mixture, if you go back into history and you do your research and you look at the mixture of Persian and Sanskrit and you look at folk culture and oral culture, that's why they call it a syncretic culture, I suppose. So I think it's a question of our existence, more or less, in the subcontinent. Ramanujan has a famous essay, A.K. Ramanujan, the poet, Is There an Indian Way of Thinking? In which he speaks of how his father, born in colonial India, was a mathematician and an astronomer on the one hand, but believed in astrology on the other. So Ramanujan writes, and I've got the quote here, in answer to how he could read the Gita religiously, having bathed, and later talk appreciatively about Bertrand Russell and even Ingersoll, he said, the father said to the son, don't you know the brain has 2 lobes? I find that a very useful way to summarize our existence in the world. Much of what we've said in this past half hour, I think, also captures that self-division. If we look at a book like Atish Taseer's Stranger in History, which is part memoir, actually memoir, it's not fictional at all. It's there he's trying to make sense of his life in the non-fiction mode, which is a divided life. Would you say that that's something that it doesn't matter whether you're writing fiction or non-fiction, that it is, or would you be tempted perhaps to deal with a subject like that in non-fiction? Have you ever written non-fiction? Would you be interested in looking at issues of our existence today in some of the very important things that you deal with within the fictional parameters of your book? Would you be interested in writing about those things non-fictionally, either in memoir form or in just essayistic form, for instance?
I love the long essay as a form, and I've written several long essays on different kinds of things. Somehow beyond a certain length, beyond a certain kind of commitment, my mind goes to fiction. And that's always been the way it is. But you know, because the brain has two lobes, it also has fiction and non-fiction.
Sure.
And there are different things you want to do in different ways. I mean, the essay has the virtue of directness, and the novel has the virtue of indirection. But what I love about the novel is that actually you can put these different characters, or ultimately you can put different novels next to each other. You know, you can put Cartography, which is very much of Karachi young people, and put that next to Home Fire, which is very much what London young people. I mean, their families are from Britain, but they've never actually spent time in Karachi.
Sure.
And I didn't want to write about people like me who are kind of back and forth, and are actually at ease in both having. I think if you grow up in one place entirely, as I grew up in Karachi, there's a sort of, you know, stability to
rootedness,
that sense, and then you can wander else. But that stability. What I want to write about people who had grown up entirely as Londoners, who thought of themselves entirely as British, but were not thought of as entirely British by other British people. And that sort of, and that I can't do in any kind of memoir form because it's not my experience, but it's one I'm interested in looking at. Yeah. And I think one of the things that happens increasingly is, you know, as a novelist, you can only have, well, I think you can only have your own personal experiences as the subject for so long, and then you start branching out into things that are not your experiences but are of great interest to you, because either in some way they interact with yours, or because they're so different from your own experiences that you think, what must that be like? And the novel allows you to try and inhabit that,
imagine
to the degree that's possible.
Sure.
Yeah.
I was very interested in the character of Karamat Lone.
Yeah.
I also thought, I wonder whether Britain actually will one day come to have a Muslim British Home Secretary. It still seems remote, well, but it may be possible.
I'll tell you, I think a British Muslim Prime Minister seems remote.
But Home Secretary?
Well, Home Secretary would just require someone, a Prime Minister, to say, you know, of all these politicians, this is going to be the important one in the cabinet. And I think actually the Prime Minister might think, well, because he's British Muslim, he's never going to be a threat to me. So let's put him in the other most important spot. So there could be, yeah, but I still think we're way off. I think London, yes, London could vote in a mayor who's British Muslim. Having said that, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought London could do it. So, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But one worries about the rest of the country that voted Brexit, for instance.
One does, and also, you know, Karamat Lone in here, the British Muslim politician, is not Sadiq Khan. You know, Sadiq Khan is very a man who's very comfortable, talking about being a Londoner. He's very comfortable about being Muslim. Everyone knows he's, you know, he's observing Ramzan and he's opening the Gay Pride Parade at the same time, and he's, you know, there are all these multiplicity going on. Whereas Karamat Lone is, because he wants national politics, is someone who speaks, even though he can't disguise the fact that his name is Karamat Lone, his parents are Pakistani, but he does everything he can to distance himself from that. He calls himself an atheist, you know, and the question then is that the kind of British Muslim you have to be in order to do well at the national level? And he certainly seems to think so.
Yeah, sure. So from the character of Karamat Lone, I had a question that was actually the first question that I wrote down, which I'm now going to sort of ask you. It might sound slightly academic, but it's not. It's just the way it's come out. I was looking up Antigone, and I was looking at readings of Antigone, and I saw that in Hegel's eyes, Antigone stands for oikos, family, and Creon for polis, the state. Antigone's brothers have slain each other in battle, as you just explained. Eteocles defending Thebes, Polynices attacking it.
Yeah.
Creon orders that Polynices be denied burial as a traitor to his own city. Antigone asserts her right to bury a member of her family. Now, the interesting thing I found was that Hegel thought both positions equally meritorious and therefore flawed. A thesis and an antithesis calling for some higher synthesis. Most later critics actually find it hard to think of Antigone and Creon as equally right and equally wrong. So the question to you, following from all of that is, do you think of Anika and Karamat as equally right and equally wrong?
I certainly think of them as both right and both wrong. But first of all, I mean, I disagree with Hegel's basic idea that Antigone represents family and Creon represents politics. And partly I think it's a very gendered reading, that he's acting in some way. When you say this body will not be buried, that's personal. And who are you punishing? You're really punishing the family. Because he can't be buried, but his sisters, and one of the sisters, by the way, is engaged to your son. I mean, it's so family with him. It is very family. And when he talks to his son about Antigone, it's quite clear. He's a deeply misogynist man. He cannot bear the fact that a girl is standing. There's much made of the fact that she's just a girl. How dare she stand up to him? So he's not this figure who's only thinking of the state. I do think they're both right and both wrong. But I think everyone has to decide with Antigone what her reasons are. And within the play, she gives many reasons for why she wants to bury her brother. And one of the reasons is religion, because the religious rituals demand that the body be buried. One of the reasons is justice, that it doesn't matter what law you pass. The idea that someone can't be buried is unjust, and justice is more important than law. But the other reason she gives is grief. And that was actually the one, when you really think about it, you are a sister, your brother is dead. That's grief enough. And now you're being told that his body will be left to rot for the birds and the dogs to peck at, right? For me, that obliterates everything else. How can you bear that? How can you bear to live in the city, to live with the stench, literally the stench of that, to see what is being done? How can you possibly say anything other than I'm going to bury my brother, because it will kill me to do otherwise? So to me, and the Antigone character, and we're not going to say exactly how that plays in this book, because I have adapted and changed things, and the brother Parvez, is actually a character in here, whereas in the play he's a corpse all along.
Yes.
But to me, she is acting out of grief. And I think one of the things that a state must do is allow its citizens to grieve. And that is precisely what Creon isn't allowing. So actually his is the greater wrong, I would say. Because as the state, you have a responsibility to your citizens. And this basic thing, let the body be buried, let the mourners mourn. It is the most simple human act that you should allow anyone else, regardless of who they are and what their family members has done.
And the interesting thing to me is how you complicate it by making it more ambiguous, actually, in the novel than it is in the play. Because this is Karamat Lone's own son that we are talking about, who lies unburied, who's not allowed to be buried in... no, it's not. It's Anika's brother. But it is Karamat Lone's son who gets involved in the whole drama of that. Okay, that's like giving too much away, maybe. So we won't proceed further. I've just been told that we need to start the question-answer session. So we'll stop there. Thank you very much for that really interesting, to me at least, discussion on the novel that I very much enjoyed reading. So do we have any questions, answers? So answers from Kamila, sorry, questions from the audience.
There's one in the front row there.
Yeah. Do we have a mic for?
Is there? If you could raise your hand again so they know where to bring the mic here. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Yeah. So I just wanted to ask, you quoted directly from Antigone in the epigraph, but you chose not to have direct quotations within the text of the novel. So was that deliberate to keep the interpretations more fluid?
It was, I mean, one of the things that I wanted was, I didn't want someone who knew Antigone to read the book and think, this is all too familiar and I know exactly what's going to happen. So Antigone, the way I think of it is that Antigone isn't the skeleton structure, Antigone is the marrow within the skeleton. And that I had to be able to transform it. I mean, it's just that central thing where the king says this body will be left to rot on the ground. Now, in contemporary Britain, no one is going to say the body will be left to rot on the ground because of hygiene laws, let alone anything else, right? It's just not going to happen. So I knew right from the beginning that there were things I wanted to change. Having said that, people who really know Antigone see where I've smuggled in certain phrases or certain kind of speeches have been slightly modified in there. So if you're hunting for clues really hard, you'll see sort of breadcrumbs there. But I didn't, and also I wanted the language to be, the language I'm using, rather than, I would have had to, because I don't speak Greek. And it's interesting, if I did speak Greek, would I have peppered my own translations? Maybe, I don't know. But otherwise, I'd be basically smuggling in Anne Carson's translations or Seamus Heaney's translations, and the register would just have been wrong, I think. Any other questions?
Yes, there's a hand up right at the back over there. Could you hand the...
Hello.
Hello.
So the way that you characterize people from Karachi in your books is very interesting. You do it in cartography a lot, than in Homefire, but is there a certain thought process that goes on when you characterize people from Karachi, for example, in the, I shouldn't spoil this, but in the final scene of Homefire.
Please don't spoil it at all.
In the final
You're
scene
not allowed to tell anyone a single thing of what happens in the final scene of Homefire.
So is there a thought process that goes on in your mind when you characterize the people from Karachi, like the way that they work, the way that they come around doing what they do? I don't want to spoil it again.
Yeah.
So is there a thought process behind that?
The thought process is Karachi is a city of 20 million. I've never thought I'm writing about, the character from Karachi. I'm writing about, in cartography, there's one group of people. Homefire, there are 4 pages set in Karachi. It's not really a novel of Karachi at all in that way. And you have, within those 4 pages, you have very different kind. There's one who's the cousin who's acting in a certain way. There are people who do the thing I'm not allowing you to speak of. There are those who are responding to what's being done. So no, to me it's such a varied place that any kind of person really can happen. With something like cartography or the earlier novels that were set here, of course there were particular kind of Karachi characters that I was writing about. But, I have a very large pool to draw from, so whatever kind of Karachi Wala is useful for the particular book I'm writing, I'll use that kind of person. Yeah.
There's a question over there. Can you pass him the mic, please? Him or her? Sorry, I can't see where it is. Oh, yes.
Excuse me.
It's coming.
I would just like to squeeze my question in a pipeline. Democratic governance, how did you choose this name? There are 2 conflicts about democracy and governance. I think the welfare state is the governance actually, but it cannot be possible when there's a welfare state and then with democratic governance. So
I don't see why it isn't possible to have a welfare state and democratic government. At the moment in Britain, of course, we don't have a particularly good welfare state thanks to the democratic governments, but in the past that has been very different. I mean, I think that the primary function of a decent democratic government should be to establish a functioning welfare state, but we're far from that reality in most parts of the world.
Absolutely.
Any other questions? There's one over there.
Can you...
Claire, if you could just wave your hand a bit so the...
Oh, there's Claire there. Yeah. Can you just pass her the mic, please? Oh, she's blocked by the... You can see her.
I just wanted to ask you about sound and text in the novel, because the Parvez character goes when he's really wanting to be a sound engineer, and there's a lot about soundscapes. But on the other side, you've talked about Antigone, that intertext, and then there's all the digital media and the different kinds of typography that you use, tweets, newspaper articles. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the relationship between sound and textuality. Thank you.
I think that would probably require an academic such as you, Claire, to write an essay on, rather than that's what you're doing. Okay, well, I'll read that. I mean, it is one of the things that was interesting to me with Parvez very early on, which is the brother of Ismail Anika. When I was trying to think about who he was, one of the first things that came to me was that he was someone who loved sound. And it was interesting to write, because as a writer, I rarely think about sound. I think much more about visuals. And so all I can say is that from a writerly point of view, it forced me to stop and think, if the way you're seeing the world is not in words or in visuals, but you're really listening to it, and you're picking up your clues from what you listen, how might the world seem, well, what is your experience of the world like in that case? And that was really what I was starting with. But I also wanted, because there is a section, as you say, which is very much about tweets and news headlines and sort of noise. And I wanted to also contrast that sort of blaring noise that becomes sort of white noise against Parvez's very acute hearing, where, you know, you can hear the wind through blades of grass, or you can hear hailstones on icicles. And the difference between hearing and noise. And I think a lot of what happens in this book is in the backdrop. There's a lot of noise going on. There's a lot of the noise of the world. And to try and actually hear what is happening within that is a bit of a challenge for everyone concerned. There's one in the second row here.
Hello.
Hello.
Please correct me if I'm wrong. The subject and the themes in your book are very different from each other. I feel that Salt and Saffron is a very different book from A God in Every Stone, but the dialogue, the structure of the dialogue is very similar. Why is that so?
For those who didn't hear it, it was that the themes of the books are very different between one and the other, say Salt and Saffron and God and Every Stone, but the dialogue, the structure of dialogue is quite similar. The themes are different, partly because I wrote Salt and Saffron when I was 26, and I wrote God and Every Stone when I was about 40, and you hope to have different things in your mind. The dialogue, the way, actually God and Every Stone, the way the dialogue is given on the page is formally very different, and it does away with inverted commas. It's also, because it does away with inverted commas, you'll see conversations that would have taken half a page in Salt and Saffron will take 3 lines in A God in Every Stone. So even though the sort of, you know, hi, how are you today, sort of that formal thing might be the same. I don't use, I mean, I have quite flat dialogue in a lot of ways, if that's what you mean. But I think the actual ways in which dialogue gets used has changed a lot. I used to use, in my earlier novels, I used dialogue to carry plot a lot more. And in the later novels, actually, I've sort of become resistant to that. And with A God in Every Stone in particular, one of the things formally I was doing with it was trying to use as little dialogue as possible. And so actually the function of dialogue, I think, has changed quite a lot between one novel and the next.
So I've just been signaled from that side that our time is up. Thank you very much for coming to listen to Kamila speak about her wonderful novel. Thank you, Kamila.
Thank you, Rosinka. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamila, and thank you, Rosinka. It's a wonderful session. Kamila will be signing her book right here at the side. For those of you who'd like to buy a copy and have a signed copy, do come around to the side of the stage here. Liberty Books is providing her book, Home Fire. Our next session starts in about 5-10 minutes. It's Me Too, Gender Issues Today. And we have Lily Salvier, Nafisa Shah, Kami Chaudhary, and Haris Gazdar. The moderator for this session will be Beena Shah. So if you give us 5-10 minutes for a changeover.